All right, everybody. So this is it's March 2022. This is little training that I put together. There's only a couple people here. Hopefully some more people come. If they don't, that's why we're recording it. So those of you that are here, if you have questions at any time, you can type them in the chat bar. You can also just sort of like raise your hand and talk if you want. But otherwise, we're going to talk about 10 ways to reduce your estate taxes. And we'll talk sort of federally and for Washington State specifically. Again, if you have any questions, just let me know. I don't have a big PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to talk. I do have some notes. That's why if you see me glancing down, that's what I'm looking at. But that's what I'm doing. So before I get started, just a reminder, if you're watching this now or later, all of the recordings for these, I'm planning on doing these sort of just once a month for a long time, are on my YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and search for CMS Law Firm, they should pop up. We have one. I did one in January. I missed February, but the plan is to show up and be here for all the months in the future. If you have topics, if you have some things that you want me to talk about specifically, happy to hear those and do my best to work.
How's Big Five without selling?
So let's dive in. Okay. All right. So to start, estate taxes. Well, what are estate taxes generally? They are a tax on the assets owned by the person that's passed away at the time that they pass away. So a lot of people believe or think that the tax flows through to the person that actually inherits the assets. And in the instance of an estate tax, the tax is paid before distributions are made. So if there's an estate that has $10 million, the estate computes the estate tax, and then those assets are distributed out to the heirs or to the beneficiaries after the tax obligation is calculated and paid. There may be like one state that has an inheritance tax, New Jersey, maybe. And in that case, once the distribution is made, then it is the obligation of the person that receives the distribution to pay the tax. The federal estate tax is a true estate tax paid before distribution. Washington State's estate tax is also a true estate tax paid before distributions are made to beneficiaries. Okay. Now, when it comes to how the estate taxes work, there are two estate taxes that Washington State residents need to know about. The first is the federal estate tax. That estate tax exemption amount, I'm looking it up right now to tell me what it is exactly, $12.06 million. Okay, so each person, if you are a United States citizen or if you are a resident in the United States here legally, typically, then you're going to have $12.06 million of exemption, which means you won't pay any estate taxes until you get over $12.06 million of assets. Those that number went up from last year. It is likely to go up again, up again next year. 2026, those estate tax numbers are set to sunset and go back to, I think, around $5 million. But they can change at any time with congressional action. Okay. So if you are over 12.6, then you are going to be taxed at basically a 40% rate of everything over 12.06. So that's real dollars. So that's why some of these strategies are good. If you're over that amount, if you're under, you don't really have to worry about it. When it comes to the federal estate tax, there is also an unlimited marital exemption, which means you can give as much money or as many assets as you want to your spouse without having to pay any estate taxes on that transfer. Okay. There is also a way, if you are married and you are a U.S. you are a U.S. citizen, to give your estate tax exemption to your spouse. This concept is called portability. There is a form that you can file with the IRS when the first spouse dies, that basically tells the IRS that you want to give your spouse, or you want to transfer that exemption amount to the spouse. So if you are married and you are both US citizens, then you basically have $24.12 million of room, okay? If you are both, if one of you is not a US citizen, there are some, it depends on who dies first and some things like that. That will be probably a topic for a different discussion. Maybe I'll just do a whole talk on non-citizen estate tax things to consider. But just know that it is a little bit different, okay? All right, Washington State has its own state estate tax that is different from the federal estate tax. The Washington State estate tax starts at $2.193 million per person, okay? And while there is an unlimited marital exemption, so you can give your spouse an unlimited amount of assets without having to pay any estate taxes, there is no portability. So the first spouse to die cannot transfer their estate tax exemption amount to the surviving spouse. What does this mean in reality? So to show you how it would work, let's say you had $10 million in assets, spouse one dies. If there was portability, you could transfer everything to the spouse, no estate taxes due. So 10 million is now in the estate of the surviving spouse, and you would have an estate tax exemption of $4.2 million, basically. Because there is no portability, you can do the unlimited transfer because you're married. So $10 million will now be in the estate of the surviving spouse. But when the surviving spouse dies, anything over 2.193 is going to get taxed. And the general way that tax is applied is from 2.2 to 3.2, the tax is 10%. From 3.2 to 4.2, the tax is 14%. And then it goes up 1% per million until you get to a flat 20% at everything over 10.2 million, roughly. Okay. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Okay. 2.193 is your threshold in Washington State to begin with. Whether you are married or not, 2.193 is where you're going to start. All right. Okay. So the other thing to recall or know is that we're going to be talking about gifting. Gifting is one of these strategies. Actually, I'll talk about that in the gift section, because I think that's number one anyway. Oh, there is one other thing that's really important to know when we're talking about estate taxes, particularly in Washington State. They recently changed the way that they determine what is Washington property, because generally in Washington State, it is going to be your Washington property that is going to be used to determine the amount of estate tax that you owe. Now, your outside property, it does factor in, but in a very, very small amount. Okay. What the rule used to be is if you owned an LLC that was out of the state of Washington. So let's say you own like a California LLC and it held real estate, for example, that LLC would not be counted as part of your estate. It would be recognized as sort of like California property and would be factored out of your estate tax calculation. Okay. That rule has since changed. So if you are a Washington State resident and you own an LLC that is called intangible property, Washington has decided that they are going to factor in intangible property when they are calculating your estate tax amount. So if you have a rental property in California and it is in a California LLC, and you are the owner of that LLC and you are a Washington resident, the value of that property is very likely to count in your estate tax determination. It used to not be the case. Okay. So be wary of that. If you are someone that holds LLCs outside of Washington State, it's very possible that the value of that LLC could be counted towards your estate tax number when they do the calculation for your Washington State assets. Now, if you are not a Washington State resident and you're watching this and you own property in an LLC that owns real estate in Washington State, so let's say like you live in Arizona and you have a house here in Washington State and it's in an LLC, that the rule also applies in the other direction. So the Arizona resident that owns a Washington LLC would not be deemed to own any Washington property because they would count that as being owned by the person in Arizona. Okay. I'm not sure why they made those rules, but that's just the way it works. Okay. So just know about that. Know that while you're thinking about what your estate tax liability might be. Also important to remember that life insurance counts. The death benefits count when you're thinking about what your estate tax, your net worth might be for estate tax calculations. So if you have $2 million net worth and you have a $2 million life insurance policy, when you die and that life insurance policy pays out, it is going to be counted as part of your estate. So you really have a $4 million estate for estate tax purposes. All right. Okay. Questions about any of that so far? Sort of background. If you do, type them in the chat if you'd like. You can also talk if you really want to. It's up to you. Okay. I will see it if you type in the chat. All right. So let's talk about these 10 ways that you can reduce your estate taxes. Okay. Way number one, very simple way is to gift. Okay. Gift. You can give away. So when it comes to giving, there are a couple different things you can do. You can give $16,000 every year to as many people as you want, and you can have there's no sort of filing, there's no tax, there's no nothing. If you are married, each of you can give $16,000 away to as many people as you want. So if you have one child and you're married, you can give them up to $32,000 a year without having to do anything. Okay. Medical and educational expenses can also be paid by you for someone else if they are paid directly to the institutions, and you do not have to file gift tax return for those things as well. Okay, so one of the ways to reduce your estate is to just begin gifting away. Where you make those gifts can be different. You can gift to individuals, you can gift to an irrevocable trust, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But gifting is one sure way to do that. One thing to remember too is that, so the second thing to remember is if the $16,000 amount does not apply to Washington State. You can give unlimited gifts in Washington State, even over and above the $2 million estate tax exemption amount. They don't care. Okay, there is no, the gift amount and the exemption amount, they are not tied together. Federally, however, they are. So if you go over $16,000 in gifts to one person in a calendar year, when you file your estate tax return for that year, you will have to notify the IRS that you have given over the amount, and there's no tax due. Anything that you go over that $16,000 in a calendar year will simply reduce your exemption amount for when you die. Okay, so we're at 12.06 million. If you gave someone $1 million, for example, in a year, your exemption would go from 12.06 down to 11.06 when you died. That makes sense? Another important thing to remember when it comes to these things, though, is that if you give a gift and you die within 3 years, it is possible for the IRS to claw that amount back into your estate. So if you give $1 million and then you die in the next week, then the IRS can potentially claw that back in and count that as part of your estate. Washington State adopts the federal rules when it comes to this clawback. So with Washington State as well, if you give a gift and then you pass away within 3 years, they will pull that back into the calculation of your net worth. So keep that in mind. Death benefit gifts typically will be pulled back in many, many circumstances. Okay. So if you have a problem with that, then you can talk to someone. There are maybe some different things that you can do that are not technically gifts that can sort of ease the transition or make it still help. Okay. Questions about gifting? Perfect. Okay. Number two, second way you can reduce your gift tax, your estate taxes, particularly in Washington State, is with something called a credit shelter trust. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that with Washington State, you cannot give your spouse your estate tax exemption when you die. There is no portability. What a credit shelter trust does is it creates a situation where when the first spouse dies, that spouse's estate tax exemption amount is captured and sort of and utilized. Okay. A credit shelter trust is a revocable living trust, which means once you create it, you can change it. You have control over it. You can do whatever you want. But essentially, within a credit shelter trust are directions that when the first spouse dies, a separate trust is created called the decedent's trust. The decedent is the person that died. That trust becomes irrevocable, which means it cannot be changed, and it is funded with the deceased spouse's Washington state estate tax exemption amount, $2.193 million. That trust, because it is an irrevocable trust, then is placed outside of the surviving spouse's estate. Okay, the surviving spouse often has access to those funds and can use them if they need them. But when the surviving spouse dies, that 2.193 that is in that decedent's trust doesn't count as part of their estate. And then they have their own 2.193 exemption amount that they can use on the remaining assets. So basically you are capturing both 2.193 exemption amounts. So you can effectively double your estate tax exemption amount with a credit shelter trust if you are in Washington state. Okay. Federally, you typically don't need a credit shelter trust because you have portability. You can give your spouse your exemption amount. But if you are non-US citizens, you can do something similar. It's called a qualified domestic trust, where you can do some things. Okay. But that is one way to capture that first spouse to die's estate tax exemption amount. Credit shelter trust. Okay. Take a drink. All right. Number three. Number three is specifically for Washington state. One of the things that you can do if you're facing a really massive Washington state estate tax bill is you can move. Okay, you just move out of the state. Your Washington state assets are what are going to be used for calculating your Washington state estate tax amount. While you live here, all of your intangible assets count: bank accounts, stock accounts, retirement accounts, life insurance proceeds. If you move out of Washington state, really just any real estate that you would own would count towards your estate tax calculation. And if you had that real estate in an LLC, you probably wouldn't be counted as having any Washington state assets. So moving out of the state is an option. It is something that people do. They'll set up a residence somewhere else. Arizona, California, those types of places, to sort of get rid of this estate tax exemption. Okay, that's a simple one. Move. Number four. I mentioned before, if you have life insurance policies, that those life insurance proceeds, the death benefits, do count as part of your estate tax calculation when you die. One of the ways that you can reduce your estate tax obligations is to take that life insurance policy that you have and move it out of your estate and put it into a trust called an irrevocable life insurance trust. Okay. Essentially, you create an irrevocable trust, which again means you cannot change it. But because you cannot change it, whatever is in that trust is not counted as part of your estate. And then you can take the life insurance policy that you have and you can give it to that irrevocable trust. So the irrevocable trust owns it. Because the irrevocable trust owns it, then when you die, the benefit that's paid out is paid into that irrevocable trust. It is not counted as part of your estate. Okay. So if you own policies currently, it's a way to reduce your estate. If you don't own policies currently, but you have if you have estate tax obligations that you know you're going to have to pay, one of the other things that you can do is create an ILIT, an irrevocable life insurance trust, park a life insurance policy in there right now, make minimum payments on it, knowing that when you die, it will pay out, and then you can use those proceeds to pay off your estate tax obligations at really pennies on the dollar. You can take a $1 million term life insurance policy, pay $100 a month or something, and when you die, you'll get paid out $1 million. That's not part of your estate that you can then use to satisfy those estate tax obligations for just whatever you have actually paid into the policy. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. This is another strategy that you can use for gifting as well. You can create an irrevocable life insurance trust. You can put a term policy in there, or most people will put a whole life policy in there. And then you can make contributions to that policy through your trust with your annual giving. So you and your spouse could give $32,000 a year, for example, into the irrevocable trust. And then that $32,000 could be utilized to pay for a whole life insurance that often will grow against the market, has some other benefits related to infinite banking and those kinds of things. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, if you guys have questions, write them in. I'm happy to answer them. Number 5 is a charitable trusts, right? Charitable remainder trusts, charitable lead trusts. I'm not going to talk about that too much because I really went into depth on that in the prior month's training. So if you want to learn about those, you can. Just know that it is a way to get highly appreciated assets out of your estate without having to pay capital gains tax by giving to charity and also keeping some money on the back end. Right? Charitable trusts, they're good. Number 6. So number 6 is donor advised funds. So if you have a charitable inclination and you would like to have some control though over how those charitable dollars are used, you can create something called a donor advised fund. Basically a fund that you set up and you put the assets into the fund, and then you get to decide how those assets are utilized for charitable purposes inside of the fund. When you pass away, you can name who the next people are that are in charge, typically family members, and those assets will typically be outside of your estate. Okay. I don't set those up. If you are curious about that, let me know. I can probably put you in touch with someone that could help you. You can Google around, but donor advised fund is a great way to sort of give back and reduce your estate at the same time. Okay. Number 7. You can invest in out-of-state assets. As we discussed, this is for Washington State specifically, but as we discussed earlier, only Washington State assets are counted as part of the estate tax calculation. So if you have some money to burn, you could invest in real estate, mostly outside of the state. Okay, the real estate does need to be in your name. If it's in an LLC, it's going to get pulled back into the state, but you can buy some real estate. Okay, or basically find some way to funnel your assets out of the state by purchasing assets in other states. Okay, number 8. Number 8 is strategically gift fractional interests. This is it's not sneaky, but it's a very nice way to give a little and also reduce your estate tax sort of exponentially. The way that you would do this is you can really only do this with businesses, okay, with LLCs. So if you have LLC that owns real estate, for example, what you would do is you can do this with real estate as well. You could gift fractional interests in that thing. Okay, so if you own an LLC and it owns a house, you could give up to $16,000 of value in that LLC per year as part of your gifting strategy. Part of that will allow you, depending on how the LLC is set up or the corporation, allow you to retain ownership of those interests. But the other thing that happens is when you give that fractional interest, it makes the entire interest less valuable. Okay, so if you own a house outright, you can sell that house to someone and they can get the whole house. If you own 90% of a house or even 99% of a house, if you give 1% of that house away to somebody else, your 99% becomes much, much less valuable because they cannot do much with that property without having that other person's consent or without having that other person sign off on what they want to do. So even giving away 1% of a property will reduce the value of that property or the value of your interest overall, usually by like 25 to 30%. So by fractionally giving away part of your LLC interest, part of your real estate interest, typically it's going to be a business interest, then you can significantly reduce your overall net worth picture. It's called market discount, okay? Because giving away that fractional interest reduces the marketability of the interest overall, right? The parts are not as valuable as the sum, as the whole. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's something you can do. So if you have real estate, if you own, going back to that example of you have an LLC in California and it holds $1 million house, right? If you die and you're a Washington state resident, that $1 million is going to count as part of your estate. If you give away 1% of that LLC to your kids, for example, that $1 million interest for you, or that $990,000 interest, is going to really drop down to like $650 because of the marketability discount of your fractional interest in that LLC. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. But those are great. Those are great things you can do if the opportunity arises. Number 9, the ninth way you can reduce your estate tax amount is to spend some money. Okay, oftentimes we all want to save. We want to make sure that we're handing down assets. We want to make sure that we are giving, and we forget that we should enjoy some of the fruits of our labor. So take a trip, buy that whatever you want. Hopefully you make sure that it works within your financial picture so that you can continue to eat over time. But it's okay to spend some money every once in a while. Speak to your financial planner or do your own math to make sure that works. But spending money is a great way to reduce your estate tax. And here's the other thing too. One of the ways that you can do that, is with family experiences. If you're going to give to charity, don't wait until you die. Give now, because then you get to see the fruits of that giving, and you also get to sort of partake in. You get to be a part of that process. Sometimes they'll let you come in and see what's going on. If you give big donations to a specific charity, they have events for people that are donors where you can experience things that you might not be able to experience. So if you are thinking about doing those things, try to do them while you are alive. Okay, that's one way to reduce everything. All right, and then number 10. So number 10 is the 10th way that you can reduce your estate taxes is with something called an intentionally defective grantor trust. Okay, it is another type of irrevocable trust. It has many different iterations. Generally, though, it is a trust that you create that is an irrevocable trust. Once you create that trust, then you will just gift assets into the trust of whatever amount that you want. Okay, some people just do the minimum or the maximum annual giving without having to file a gift tax return, $16,000. Some people give way more than that and just file gift tax returns. Once you give that money into that trust, then it's out of your estate. A couple of things to remember there is number 1, anytime you make a gift to someone, they are going to take that gift with the same tax basis that you have acquired it with. So if you buy a house for $100,000 and it's now worth $1 million, and you give that house to someone while you're alive or to an irrevocable trust while you are alive, if they are going to get it with the same tax basis as you, $100,000. If they sell that house, they will pay capital gains tax on that $900,000 of appreciation. It's important to remember. If the assets transfer after you die, right now, you get a step up in basis and you don't have to pay that tax. You take it, that property, as if it's purchased for $1 million. So all that capital gains tax is gone. Okay. That may not matter when you're talking about the estate tax. The estate tax might be more detrimental than the capital gains tax. So you may want to make that gift. The other thing that's kind of interesting with an intentionally defective grantor trust, the reason they are defective is that they are set up so that any income tax that the trust has to pay is passed through to the person that created the trust. You might be like, well, why would I want to create a trust and then have to pay more tax? What that allows you to do is it allows the assets inside of the trust to grow without having to be reduced by an income tax. And it allows the person that created the trust to reduce their own personal estate by paying the taxes of the irrevocable trust. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So you get a double dip. You get to continue to have appreciation in the irrevocable trust tax-free, and you get to reduce your own estate by paying the taxes that are created by the assets that are inside of the irrevocable trust. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. All right, that's it. That's my 10 ways to reduce estate taxes. If you all have any questions, type them into the chat bar. I'll wait for a couple minutes, couple seconds, and then we'll just wrap it up. Hopefully that makes sense. If it did, that's great. Let's see. Yeah. So Sharon, you're right. So if you're going to invest in out-of-state assets, you're going to want to buy them not in an LLC. You have to own them personally. If you're worried about liability, one of the things that you can do is purchase additional insurance on those properties specifically. You can also purchase umbrella policies that include those real estate holdings. So there are some other things that you can do to sort of reduce your liability potentially, if that fits into your risk tolerance. But that would definitely be something that you would want to consider doing, or consider if you are going to do something like that. But you're right. Buy real estate in your own, just personally. So the tax rate that you pay in Washington. So the question is, what is the tax rate that you pay in Washington State over the exemption amount? So it's 2.193, but just call it 2.2. So from 2.2 to 3.2 million is 10%. From 3.2 to 4.2 million is 14%. And then it goes up 1% per million until you get to a flat 20% on anything over 10 million, 10.2 million, and up is 20%. Okay. Can you set up an LLC to put your primary residence into? You can, but you're going to have some other potentially unintended consequences. You lose all of your personal real estate exemptions and credits and things like that. So there's a personal residence capital gains tax exemption. You can write off your mortgage interest. I think you could do that even if it's in an LLC, but you do lose some things if you move your primary residence into an LLC. You also, if you do that, lose some of the protections that go along with being a primary residence, having a primary residence. So there may be some bankruptcy protections, there may be some Medicaid protections, some things like that. So before you put your primary residence into an LLC, make sure that you do some research, probably and talk to an attorney, make sure that it's the right thing for you to do, that you haven't sort of thought or missed any unintended consequences. So Judy asks, if you buy real estate in another state, say Hawaii, wouldn't that then be subject to Hawaii estate taxes? It would if Hawaii had an estate tax, but I think Washington, Illinois, New Jersey, Iowa maybe are the only states that have a state estate tax. Most states don't have one. That's why moving is a good idea. And I'll look real quick. See what this says here real quick. What states have an estate tax? Yeah, Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, Nebraska, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Washington State, I believe is what it is. Yeah, okay, here we go. Most of them are pretty small. Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, Illinois, New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, DC. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Iowa, and Nebraska have an inheritance tax. So just stay away from those states. Thankfully, they're all states where they're not warm. So you're not going to want to move that. That's my only criteria. What's the average temperature? That's where I'm moving. So if you buy property in another state, you want to make sure that state is not subject to inheritance or estate taxes, if that is something that's important to you. The other thing that I guess a good thing to sort of end on, if you have questions, keep hitting me with them. But another one important thing to hit on is that it's really important to remember that reducing your estate tax to zero is not always the best thing to do. You know, whenever you're going to do that, you're going to give up. There are going to be sort of consequences to receiving that benefit, and vice versa. There will be other benefits to the consequence of having to pay some estate taxes. So just make sure as you go through this process that you don't get so stuck on wanting to reduce your estate taxes to zero that you begin to make decisions that don't actually align with your values and with what you want to do in your life, because that can sometimes get in the way and cause you to make decisions that while they are good for reducing your estate taxes, don't actually sort of move you in the direction that you want to go personally. And people have different ideas on what that means, just based on their own personal values, their own family, all those kinds of things. So keep that in mind as you think about these things, as you go through this process. The same applies with income tax as well. You know, there are ways to get your income tax down to zero, but you may not want to deal with the other side of that. Okay. Questions? Any more questions? All good questions, by the way. So we're going to wrap it up, I think. Thank you for those of you that came. Remember, next the first Friday of the month at noon, we're going to be doing these every time. This same Zoom link will work. So just keep the Zoom link somewhere handy, put it on your calendar, and I'll see you guys hopefully next month. All right. Thank you guys for coming. And this will be on YouTube as well, the recording, so you can check it out. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend. Have a great March. Bye.